One rhyme at a time, unpacking the meaning and the muse with the Poetic Diva is podcast programming that reminds us of the connection between poetry and mental and emotional wellness. This program has been brought to you by Rhyme and Chat Interactive Poetry Organization, thanks to the financial and technical support of the Lyndhurst Foundation, First Property Management, and Gold Nook Publishing. So, whether you're a poetry enthusiast or simply someone seeking inspiration and understanding, join us as we unravel the threads of creativity and introspection, one rhyme at a time. Welcome to the conversation.
Welcome to One Rhyme at a Time, Unpacking the Meaning and the Muse podcast, where poetry meets mental wellness, right here in the heart of Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm your host, the Poetic Diva, and I am thrilled to embark on this poetic healing journey with you. As in every episode, we are being visited by a poet and a mental health professional. We are going to be talking today about childhood trauma. We are joined by poet Cynthia Robinson Young. Born and raised in Newark, New Jersey, Cynthia Robinson Young migrated back to her family's southern roots after a 30-year stopover in California. She now lives in Chattanooga. She is the author of the chapbook Migration, for which she was named finalist in the 2019 Georgia Author of the Year Award, and the chapbook Reflections of a Feral Mother by Bottle Cap Press in 2024. Cynthia is the mother of 8 children and grandmother to 18, all residing in the Chattanooga area. Her work has appeared in journals and magazines, including The Writer's Chronicle, Poetry South, The Amistad, The Decolonial Passage, Freedom Fiction, Rigorous, and Sisteries. Cynthia has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net for 2023. Right there. An excerpt from her novel In Progress, entitled Why Mama May Believed in Magic, appears in the anthology Dreams for a Broken World by Essential Dreams Press. No, you didn't know. So let's listen in as Cynthia shares her poem for dead molesters whose secrets we've kept, after William Evans, on One Rhyme at a Time.
Pray for those who are not in heaven, though the preacher promised them they would be as they lay in front of the church, rigor mortis, stone cold dead, but made up to look like the mugshot we gave the undertaker. Question if our forgiveness for their sins against us, against our bodies, against our childhood, will actually free them of the atrocities we can recant if we try not to suppress them. Who will deliver us from their evil if they took the evil with them and didn't admit or release it, like the thief on the wrong side of the crucified Jesus, still hanging onto his cross of unbelief? The power was never something we possessed, though we yearn for its voice. May we rest in peace.
Thank you, Cynthia, for sharing your poem with us. So, as I read through this poem, I couldn't help but wonder, first of all, is this poem about your story, or is this a poem that was inspired by the story of someone else?
So it's my story, the story of cousins, the story of just women I've talked to who've grown up and were able to tell those, childhood trauma stories. So it's kind of a universal women's story. And then, of course, it's personal as well.
So you mentioned after William Evans as a part of the title, what is William Evans? What is his connection to this poem?
Okay, so one of the ways that the process in which I write is I'm reading, I'm experiencing life. And so I was reading a poetry book by William Evans, and he has a poem, and it starts off, "Say a prayer for my father who art not in heaven yet." And I'm like, well, that sounds like something that, is he in heaven? I guess those questions came up, which made me think about who is in heaven, then I, connected it to how come every time, no matter how wicked or mean somebody is, when they die, then all of a sudden they're all going to heaven
All
and they
going
were
to
great
heaven.
people.
Yes.
And so I'm like,
yeah.
yeah, let's pray for those who are not in heaven instead of always thinking that
Everybody goes to
goes
heaven.
that way.
And we've all heard that time
Mhm.
and time again. We attend a funeral and we know, or we believe that we know, because nobody really knows
Right.
in those final moments
Yeah.
what happened between that person and the
Yeah,
Lord.
that last 2
those who have
seconds.
right. Those who have that type of background, it's like we know, it's like we can't really know if somebody is saved and truly saved. However, we do have those thoughts when we think back in our memory of people, and it's like, they made some bad decisions.
Yeah.
They didn't treat people well.
Right.
But yet in that moment, the pastor is giving
Yeah.
accolades and, they're up there with the Lord, and
Yeah.
to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And it can be a tough pill to swallow, especially if you're sitting in the seat of someone who has been molested
Right.
or
And
somehow traumatized.
they know that uncle or,
Yeah.
whatever. And they're like,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
never said nothing to me about. So that's how it goes into, they never heard that, I admit that I did this to you.
Right.
So they don't know as they're sitting there at the funeral, what happened? Did he really repent? Because he didn't repent to me. I never heard anything. So
Right. I do get that. Now, you had mentioned a poetry book by William Evans. Share with us the name of that book that inspired.
okay. Well, it's called "Still Can't Do My Daughter's Hair." And he's a great poet.
Yes, because we want to give him the credit for the work that he's done that has inspired you. And that's one of the things that I love about art and poetry specifically, because there are things that we do write about that are inspired by our own life, our own experiences, but there are also things that happen in our lives that impact us in such a way that it triggers poetry.
It triggers. I like that. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. It triggers.
Does. It does. So I really appreciate that. And thank you for giving a nod to fellow poet William Evans. There were several very interesting things that I caught in this poem. One, I am always intrigued by poetry that is short, to the point, and impactful, because so many times you'll come across a poem that's 4 or 5 minutes long if somebody is actually reading it. It's a long poem because in some cases it takes a while to get that whole message out.
Right.
But when you're able to get that message out with the power and the emotion in just 4 stanzas and just, a short, I believe that there's like some extra work that goes into that, because you have to get rid of some extra stuff.
Right.
Share a little bit about like what your process is to kind of whittle it down to just the meat of it.
Well, I'm in a poetry critique group. And every time it's my turn to read, they go, "Oh no, here we go." So yeah, I got stuff to say.
There you go.
And it goes on and on. So every once in a while, I really want to, like you said, learn how to hone it down and really get to the meat of it. So that's always my goal, especially when you're sending out work. They usually like a page, and when you're sometimes they'll say, you can go on and on as long as you want, but the chances of me getting published increase if I can keep it to one page. So that's part of the process of why I just keep going over and over and trying to tighten it up. And then sometimes when you go into the revision, you're like, I don't need all those words. This is not a short fiction story. And then you can start cutting things out and tightening them, which is what I like about poetry.
As I'm reading through it, it leans itself to the Lord's Prayer came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
So was that intentional in having some different places that kind of lean into?
Yeah. So I said, let's just go through that, use that as the backbone and the framework of the poem. So that was my thought process in doing that. Like, what do these words say and how do they fit into the poem?
Well, it definitely came through. It definitely came through. Starting with the beginning, praying for those who are not in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
I did not know, I'm not familiar with William Evans, so I did not realize it was coming from a different poem,
Mm-hmm.
but I did think about the Lord's Prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it gets into forgiveness and who will deliver us from their evil,
Mm-hmm.
and then also the ending, just kind of wrapping it up with, may we rest in peace.
Mm-hmm.
All of that made me think of the Lord's Prayer. And I think that was really, really a cool way to package it, to have it within the framework, as you mentioned, like the backbone of the poem. There's another part of the poem that stands out to me, and it's the fact that you used the word mugshot. And I'm like, oh, that was like a boss poetic move in doing that. So share a little bit with us as far as the intentionality and the deeper meaning in using the word mugshot in that play. And maybe read that line for those who don't have the luxury of looking at it like we're looking at it.
So we're praying for this person we don't think is in heaven, but he's lying stone cold dead, but he's made up to look like the mugshot we gave the undertaker. And I was thinking about when my mother passed, we had to give a picture so that they could recreate her as, to look as lifelike as she could. But I was thinking, what if all he had was when he was in, being bad
Mm-hmm.
and in prison for what he had done. And all we got, let's hear. Oh, you want to know who he is? Here's the mugshot.
That's who he is. Yes. So I did think about that. I'm like, okay, so this is somebody who, in the eyes of the author of the poem, has done something criminal.
Yeah.
He's, so the photo is the mugshot because he's been arrested for the crime, which in actuality, he didn't get arrested for it. It's almost as if he
I just wanted to give that idea that the mugshot, he might not have gotten away with everything. He got away with this, but he's so bad. He's, they caught him on something else.
Yeah, that mugshot.
So it could go both ways.
That mugshot. Also, question if our forgiveness for their sins against us, against our bodies, against our childhood, will actually free them of the atrocities we can recant if we try not to suppress them. Explain to us what you mean by that passage.
I think a lot of times in childhood abuse, that children, as they grow up into, young adults, they just try not to think about what happened. Usually something else. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I would think that it comes out in different ways. So they're not really like honing in on the trauma, but how is it manifesting itself in other parts of their lives while they're trying to suppress it? And sometimes it gets suppressed because, they, go to their parents and say this, that, and happened. They're like, no, he didn't do that. He wouldn't do that. So they just say, you know what? I'm just not going to think about it. And then they suppress and they bury those memories, but then it might come out in an awkward situation.
That's true. That's true.
And not even like, maybe when they get married, it comes out that way, sexually or whatever, or how they end up living their lives because of that trauma, that they wouldn't have gone down that path, but the trauma is taking them down that way.
And I guess that's the difference between suppressing versus addressing.
Ooh, okay.
Oh, I'm a poet too. I'm a poet too. But suppressing as compared to addressing and actually going through the process of healing and recovering.
Right.
So even though we may suppress some of those things, they're still there. They never go. They don't go away until we face them. Who will deliver us from their evil? Just sticking to that part of the poem. Give us the backstory on some of the word choices.
Well, I said, who will deliver them from their evil if they took their evil with them and didn't admit or release it? And I'm thinking about, we're supposed to confess our sins and he's faithful and just to forgive us. But if they haven't confessed it, how they're not getting delivered from that evil, So that's what I was thinking in terms of that.
And then you mentioned the thief on the wrong side of the crucified Jesus. And I'm like, okay, so I had to go back. I had to go back to my Sunday school. I'm like, because I know about the thief on the right side, because we hear about that thief. But I'm like, I need to dig back and see. So the thief that hung on the left side of Jesus was kind of pinned as being the bad thief. That was
he was like, whatever, you don't have any power to do anything. You're up here with us.
Yeah.
So
and mocked Jesus.
Yeah. So he never repented of the reason why he was up there. He was up there because he did something wrong.
And never owned it. And didn't feel like he was deserving of the punishment that he was getting and was looking for a way out of it.
And when you talk to, molesters, they'll like, I didn't do that. Or they'll say things like, well, you asked for it. I mean, all sorts of crazy stuff would be coming out of their mouths.
Yes.
But a lot of times they don't admit it. Like, that didn't happen. And you're like, it so did happen. They're like, no, we didn't do that. So one of the big things, that happened that helped with this poem is that when I don't know how old I was, I know I was in elementary school. And at the corner, there was a barbershop. And I don't know why children are such easy prey because we just trip, like, what are we thinking? So now as an adult, I'm like, what? But anyway, there was a men's barbershop at the corner. And I was coming home one day, and I usually was with my cousins, but for some reason I was by myself. And he, the one barber was left in the shop, and he called me in, and he said, I must have been a preteen, because he said, do you want a facial? And I'm like, ooh, a facial. Can that be fun?
Yeah.
And he's really nice. And, so I said yes. And so he said, well, just sit down in the chair, and so then he started on my face, and then his hands started moving down to my neck. And then we, just kept going. And then when he, I finally said, you know what, I want to get up. Because I knew that's not where you're supposed to be.
Yeah,
That is not, and then do my face,
Right.
And so I went right home, and my grandmother, she had sent me for something, and she was like, where's my snuff? And I'm like, oh. And I said, I forgot it. And she said, what happened? Why? And then I told her, and as soon as my mother got home from work, she told my mother. My mother was like hopping mad.
Right.
And she went up and, because everyone, he was a neighborhood, she went up and she yelled at him, and she said that she was calling the cops and everything. So
Kudos to your mom.
yeah, I was really proud of her, that she didn't like say that didn't happen or, crazy, it could have been, it could have gone a different way.
So yeah, so that it's very, very fortunate that you had family members that heard you
Mm-hmm.
and that took action. And for so many, this is their story.
Yeah.
This is their story because when there's been trauma and it's been unresolved, you still carry it. Like you carry that your entire life. You carry it.
And it's like me and you, if we were growing up together and, we saw that happening, we knew about it. Even with us, what power do we have together even, to help maybe the third person who's getting molested?
That's true.
We just know about it because we're all the same age. But that's why I feel for children because they're so powerless, and if we don't have mature adults who can stand in our corner, it's just rough for them.
And I do feel like that kids do have power, but if they don't have those adults in their life, like how you just described, they don't realize that they have power.
Right.
They believe that their voice has no value, has no strength, and nobody's going to listen to me until they have adults who actually listen to them
Right.
and actually speak life into them. So how would you describe your writing style when it comes to the creation of poetry?
I don't say mind my own business, but I react, I guess. I listen to what's going on around me, usually something in the news or someone's experience just sparks something. So the way that I write actually is I will get like either the first line or I'll get the whole poem. So I usually write the poem as soon as I have it. Like this, pray for those who are not, I'm like, pray for those who are not in heaven. Yeah. And I'll give the next line, though the preacher promised them they would be. And then it just keeps flowing. Because I'm also a fiction writer. So I'm kind of writing the story out, but in a poetic form. So I usually get the whole poem in one shot. And then I go back later and revise it. I'll come back and I'm like, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean to say that. Or, or I thought I said that, and then that's when the revision comes in.
Yeah, and there is power in having as a part of your process to lay it all out and then walk away from it for a while.
Yeah.
And then come back. What does that do for you to leave it and then come back to it later?
If it's good, I'm like, who wrote that? I'm like, oh, that's my name. That's my right? If it's bad, then I'm like, I took this workshop with Jericho Brown when he came to Chattanooga. And he told us, don't throw anything away that you write. So any poets out there, he said, because there's always something. So say that this whole poem is trash, except who will deliver us from their evil? And then everything else is like, no. Keep the poem because it might fit in another poem. So that was really helpful. So yeah, I've got lots of stuff. And then I'll go back and I'm like, no. But that one line, I could go with something else that I just said, and then you just move things around. So that was great advice from a Pulitzer Prize winning poet.
Yes, Jericho Brown. Yes, ma'am. So how has poetry helped you just in life when it comes to your healing journey?
Well, I always was a journalist. So I found my box. My mom, when my uncle just cleaned out everything because he lived with my mom. And he said, this box is yours. And in it was my diary, the little pink one with the little key.
The little lock on the side.
Yeah. And so I've always written out my feelings. And I didn't like being a child because I did feel powerless. And so I always wrote my feelings, in my diaries, which then became journals. And then, as I became a poet, those things went into my poetry. So I process life through writing. So, which all writers do.
We do. We do. So as we wrap up, your poem ends with "The power was never something we possessed, though we yearned for its voice. May we rest in peace." Unwrap that for us.
I learned that you can't wait for someone to ask forgiveness for something they've done wrong. And I had to learn that the hard way. And, and I have a friend who's like, she's still waiting. I'm like, girl, stop. Because it just holds you down.
It does.
So I'm saying, may we just let it go. Whatever happens, we don't know where this person's at, but we need closure. So the prayer is, may we just rest in peace, knowing that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and not ours. Because we cannot change people's hearts, and we can't make them say, you need to say that, because they might not say it. And so are we going to, lay in bondage to those people that won't ask for forgiveness from us? Or should we just say, you know what? We need to have peace. So
Forgiveness is more for us than it is for them.
absolutely 100.
If somebody's wanting to get in touch with you, how can they contact you?
You can go to my author website, which is www.cynthiarobinsonyoung.com. It's all one word, no spaces.
Wonderful. We thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Cynthia for sharing her poem for dead molesters whose secrets we kept, and for giving us a deeper understanding behind the meaning and the muse of her poetry. The overarching theme in this poem was childhood trauma. We may not realize it, but some of the ways that we experience, respond, and interpret life as adults is from the perspective of our own unhealed trauma from our childhood. How do we recognize it? How do we reconcile with it? How do we start on our path to recovery? Well, we're going to talk about it with our guest and mental health professional, MyChelle Pinkerton. But before we do, it is important that I remind you that this podcast is not a substitute for therapy. Always seek the advice of your physician or qualified healthcare provider with any questions that you may have regarding your mental, emotional, and physical health. Now, with that being said, let's get a better understanding of coping with childhood trauma. MyChelle Richardson Pinkerton is a marriage and family therapist licensed in the state of Tennessee. She is the director of The Haven, a counseling services department of Silverdale Baptist Academy. She is an approved supervisor for the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and a Master of Arts degree in Marriage and Family Therapy with a concentration in sex therapy from Richmond Graduate University. For 20 years, MyChelle has been passionate about being present for those walking through the trials of life. She desires to equip family, couples, and individuals with the tools to fight against the darkness and to break out of bondage. She wants them to know that while walking through fire can be painful, there's always beauty on the other side. Join me in welcoming our guest, Ms. MyChelle Pinkerton. MyChelle, welcome to One Rhyme at a Time, and we are honored to have you join us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, so we just got through talking to a poet, Cynthia, about her poem for dead molesters whose secrets we have kept. And there is a strong connection between her poem and the journey that some people go through in regard to dealing with childhood trauma once they've reached adulthood. So let's start our conversation with getting a better understanding of what is childhood trauma.
hmm So, childhood trauma, there are experiences that one might have in childhood that leave a lasting impression. It could be anything that ranges from abuse, whether that's physical, sexual, emotional. It could be surviving a natural disaster. It could be experiencing the divorce of a parent, a death of a parent, and it shifts the way you view the world, you view yourself, and you view relationships. And it'll have effects throughout your life.
I appreciate the fact that when when you were giving the definition of trauma, that it wasn't just based on like a
Mm,
sexual, encounter or something like that. It seems like just about anything that kind of shakes our foundation,
mhm,
changes our routine,
mhm.
makes us kind of question the things that we used to trust and things like that, that challenges our trust. Any of that can lead to trauma.
Absolutely. Some therapists will categorize them as big T trauma and little t trauma. My personal favorite definition of trauma is anything your brain cannot handle. And when you think of a child, there's a lot in terms of their brain development that they just don't have the resourcing to be able to handle.
That is a really, really valid point. Really, really valid point. So what are some ways that being traumatized in childhood, what are some ways that it may show up in our adult life?
One of the major areas is in my world, in therapy world, we would call your attachment. And it is how you form relationships and how you view relationships. And oftentimes that is the area that might take the biggest hit when a traumatic event occurs. So in an abuse situation, the safety, the trust, that would have taken a huge hit. And so, how you attach from that point forward would be negatively affected. So, where someone had been safe and secure for you, you no longer have that. So, depending on the age that you were when that occurred, it might shake your trust in yourself and being able to establish those safe relationships. So then, as an adult, you might avoid attaching to people. You might put up those walls. It might be that there's anxiety around how you attach to people.
So when there's trust
Sure.
issues, and the trust issues are seemingly based on nothing,
Mm,
like there's nothing that that particular person has done
mhm,
to cause you to lose trust.
mhm,
What can be done
mhm,
in a situation like that when one is not trusting and they're not really even sure where it's coming from?
mhm. Well, I think there needs to be space for the other partner to say, "I've not done anything. Maybe this is something we need to look deeper into." And the invitation to be able to go to therapy at that point, because couples therapy doesn't necessarily only mean you're married. It's you're dating or you're even thinking about dating. That's a beautiful time to go to couples. Like, please come to therapy at that point. We would love that to give you some tools for communication and to maybe shine a light on, like, okay, so I'm hearing from you that you're struggling with trust. Your partner is doing their part because there are two components to trust, right? Someone has to be trusting and someone has to be trustworthy. Your partner's being trustworthy. They're doing what they said they would do. They are where they say they're going to be. Your role in trusting, that's kind of where the breakdown is going. So we might need to explore. And a therapist would go back a little bit and say, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your experience in your family of origin. What are some of those key moments, hallmark moments of your life where trust may have taken a hit? So we can explore what those lessons you learned there that you're trying to apply in this current situation.
I bet you that is life changing for some people to have like gone through their entire life with this um, like characteristic or quality in their personality. They don't really know why they are that way, but they've kind of like damaged relationships like over years of their life. And then they finally get to a point to where they realize, oh my goodness, I didn't even think about what happened to me when I was 10,
Yeah.
and that I'm still responding to that.
Yes.
So that's a beautiful thing, a beautiful thing. And another thing that I also kind of heard you lean in on is that you don't have to wait until there's a problem to go see a therapist.
Right. Right.
So share with us a little bit about how does therapy look for those of us who believe that we're well, because we're all kind of going through and dealing with something,
Absolutely.
But those of us who believe that we're functioning well, what does therapy look like in those cases?
So I often use the analogy of you do regular maintenance on your car, right? You go for oil changes, you get the tires rotated, not necessarily because, you need a new transmission, but the maintenance is what prolongs those more expensive car repairs. And so that's what therapy can do as well, where you might be in a time of life where things seem to just be hitting on all cylinders, and you want that to continue to be the case for as long as possible. You might be in a time of life where there are some rough patches, some storms have come up, and you're losing your footing a little bit. A therapist would love to come alongside you to say, here are some tools. And I always tell my clients and currently my students, if it's a skill, the hope is that you can learn it. Because if it's a skill, you can learn it. And so if I give you enough skills in your toolbox, you'll be able to navigate these things.
In order for the now adult to like reconcile and make it through that journey to healing, does their abuser have to be involved in that process?
No.
Okay,
No.
so what does that look like? What does that look like?
There are many different types of trauma therapy. The type that I am trained on, the abuser doesn't have to be present. And oftentimes the abuser isn't even alive by the time that someone is ready to be able to process through that particular hurt, and for many, many reasons. And so often trauma therapy does not involve the abuser at all. That's a huge risk in inviting them into that space because they may not be repentant, which would cause further damage. So oftentimes they're not a part of the picture, but you can still process through your experience because it's all from what you experienced. So with the safe EMDR, we're going through physically, what did that feel like in your body? Those sensations that show up. And the beautiful way that our brains are developed and designed is that it will link a similar sensation to a memory, even though they may not have anything to do with each other. So going with your five senses, sight, hearing, smell being the strongest. So using that, we can use that sensation, give you the skills to self-soothe and calm as you process the trauma that you experience through that abuse narrative.
And what about in a situation, and I know every situation is different, so we're speaking just in generalities.
Sure.
What about the situation when the abuser is still there, still present, you're still having to like face them, and it's a situation to where they aren't owning any of it, like nothing ever happened, but yet what happened, and it's like this was real.
Yes.
And they're coming to get healing, to get on their healing path. What does that look like for them?
So a beautiful thing we can do in therapy is the empowering your voice, reclaiming your voice, right? Because often in those abuse situations, your voice was taken from you. Your power was taken from you. You were silenced in many different ways, right? The actual act of silencing you, but even in hindering you from telling your story, you were silenced. So the therapy room has the ability to be that safe space to reclaim that. And so we would work through what that looks like. How do you defend those boundaries? How do you even establish those boundaries? Let's say the abuser is a family member, and for this extent of time, you felt like I have to interact with that person, where a therapist can come alongside and broaden your perspective. Again, we're zooming back out to say there are ways that you can keep yourself safe. And there's something very healing in adult you being able to protect you that little you needed someone to do for them in that moment.
Okay. So as we're talking about the ways that childhood trauma can manifest in our adulthood,
Mm-hmm.
I know that you already talked about how it shows up in our relationships and like possibly our inability to trust and things of that nature. Does it ever affect our ability to like react to things in a proper way?
Yes. Yes.
So give us some examples of how it can show up in that way.
Yes. So when trauma occurs, no matter when it occurs, but especially when it occurs in childhood, it reshapes our brain, right? It affects the way that we process information. If you can imagine like a road, executive decision making, there are all these points that need to be gone through in order to make a wise decision, right? We're evaluating the information, we're gauging it against experiences that we've had before. We are projecting, if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen. And then we make our decision. When traumatic things occur, there's almost a shortcut. So imagine like a road closed sign coming up, and you're not able to access those executive decision making skills anymore because that takes too much time. Because again, the beautiful thing about our brains is it wants us to survive. That's a key goal of our brain. We got to survive. So I don't have time to figure out if black bears eat people or if brown bears eat people. I see a bear, I'm out. So the road closed sign goes up and we have these shortcuts. Well, along with the executive decision stuff is some of the emotions, and we cut off some, we cut them all off, and they show up in different ways, right? Because again, the body sensation informs our brain on what is happening. So a similar sensation shows up like in a death as there's some uncertainty. So anxiety is probably going to be there. Sadness is going to be there. A lot of those similar emotions that you had during the trauma. And our brain goes, oh, we don't deal with those. We cut them off and we do something else. And so where we would say, oh, you're not responding appropriately, a therapist who had a trauma lens would go, oh, I wonder what happened to you.
Wow. And in some cases, we don't even know what happened to us.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like, this is the way that I've always remembered myself being.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good time to go see a therapist.
Right. Or maybe the trauma happened before you were verbal.
Yeah. Yeah. So even at that young stage, things that happen to us can still carry an
Absolutely.
That's really interesting. So like in a lot of cases, like when I think about childhood trauma, I think about, things that happen when a child is 5 and when they're 12 and, things of that nature. But there's even things as a parent, like that really just makes you kind of take pause and think about, what are some of the things that I'm exposing my child to at a very, very young age while their brain is still developing. That's really interesting.
And it can go back even further. So I have worked with someone where the trauma, one of the big traumas that we were processing through was her birth was it was a lot. A lot happened, like lungs collapsed, whole thing, and her body remembered that. And so that shows up and we can reprocess that. That's the beautiful thing about EMDR. We can go back and we can reprocess those things.
Okay. So we have a question that came in from our studio audience. And this person is wanting to know if a trauma response can be linked to things like forgetting the details of the situation that you had that was traumatic.
Yes.
Okay, so and is that like another way that the body is like protecting itself?
Yes.
Okay, so share with.
So again, the way our brain, it is so focused on our survival. It does all kinds of things to try to help us survive. So well, an example is if you think about our first responders, right? They have to process and switch from these traumatic calls, like back to back to back to back to back. Oftentimes, what will happen is as they take the time and have space to be able to process those calls, there might be like an image or something that represents that traumatic experience. So it might be that you don't remember anything else but the color of the walls, or you focused in on the ceiling, or you focused in on a particular article of clothing or a blanket. Part of that is you're dissociating, so you're not present in the moment as the trauma is happening. That's a protective measure. And then your brain is saying, we cannot handle remembering all details of this. So we're going to pack it away. And this one image, let's say the color of the walls, becomes representative of that.
And that could even lead to a person being exposed to the color of the walls and reacting
Yes.
and not really sure. It's like, why am I reacting to this? And it's
Yes.
because of that
Yes.
previous
Yes.
situation where they were protecting themselves from the trauma that was right there in front of them.
Yes.
As this person struggles to express how they feel, and they struggle with their emotions.
Mm.
So how can somebody overcome that?
Mm-hmm. In the safety of a therapy room, your therapist will be able to gently help you identify. Again, I'm heavy on what shows up for you in your body, what each emotion feels like in your body, because oftentimes we so let's go with anger. Anger is often the one that gets a bad rap, right? So depending on your childhood, maybe even the part of the country you grew up in, you weren't allowed to be angry. You had no reason to be angry, right? All your needs were provided for. However, we know anger is a valid emotion that we all experience. It shows up to tell us something. So a therapist could work with you on how does that show up in your body? And then now you have this choice. What are you going to do with it? So the miracle equation is this is what I feel. This is what I need because this is what I feel.
Give me an example of that.
So sometimes for anger, I am feeling angry. What I need is to give my anger a voice. And when I sit with it long enough, I might discover it's actually sadness.
And in a lot of cases, we may be mislabeling
Yes.
the emotion.
Yes. And especially for our men, most likely they are mislabeling because society as a whole, we have only allowed them to be hungry and angry. My heart hurts for them the most because growing up, they get the message you can be hungry, you can be angry, you go in there, you go to sleep. You know, men don't cry, all of those things. We make you shut all those other emotions down. But then when you're an adult, let's say in a relationship, women, we're upset because why won't you let me in? Why don't you feel anything? What's wrong with you? But that is how it's a no-win situation for them, which is it's not fair.
I agree. And then there's also situations to where the woman in the man's life may ask those questions, why don't you open up? And then when the man does open up, their response can cause trauma.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we've talked a great deal about therapy and the importance of getting therapy in the good times, the great times, and the not so great times, how important it can be to have that established already. What are some things aside from therapy that a person can do to assist them in trying to just reconcile some of those feelings when they know that they are dealing with some trauma from their childhood?
If therapy feels too big of a jump, which makes perfect sense, there are books, there are podcasts. There are a lot of great books that are out there now. The Body Keeps the Score is a great one. What Happened to You is a good one. To just begin in yourself to be exposed to all the ways that what you experienced growing up still plays a role and how you react in your world currently. Journaling around that, having safe friends around you, or to be able to process some of that with, that would eventually lead you on the path to being comfortable with seeking out a therapist. And it could be that one-on-one therapy is too scary. There's group therapy that could be really great. Doesn't necessarily have to come from therapeutic setting. A lot of even hospitals, they'll have like grief groups or survivor groups that let that be a way to dip your toe in before you identify someone that you feel comfortable working with one-on-one.
What's the benefit for the person to just be able to get it out?
Part of it is going back to the reclaiming and the empowering of your voice, because that is one thing that got shut down. And so having your story witnessed to, there's power in just having someone serve witness to you, whether it's through something traumatic or it's just grief or just sharing in the joys of life. To have someone that comes alongside you and says, I'm going to serve as witness to your experience and validate that what you're experiencing makes sense to me, and that it's valid. You should be feeling those things. There's power in that.
Okay, and so like if you're on the other side, if there's a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, a dear friend, and you know that there's somebody who's navigating and kind of dealing with some trauma from their past, what are some ways that you can support them?
Listen. Just be a great listener. Be an active listener. Don't push. Don't take them further than where they're ready to go. But just show up and be a great listener and hold that story and know that that's a sacred space, because they haven't shared that with everyone and they're sharing that gift with you. So treat it like that sacred gift. Don't go blab it all over town, but hold it.
Don't head to social media.
Yeah,
with it.
just hold it, and you'll feel it. You'll feel the sacredness of that particular moment, and then encourage them in whatever way sees fit. But eventually, when the time is right, to seek out further help.
I heard you say something about active listening. And I know that with active listening, it has a certain look. It looks a certain way. It sounds a certain way. So explain to us what active listening actually is.
So with active listening, you are keyed in to what the person is saying. You're not formulating your response. You're not formulating questions. For those that I work with, that often I'm teaching them how to be an active listener, and this often shows up in couples. I encourage them, if you need to, take notes. There is nothing wrong with that. Now, if someone's sharing you their traumatic experience, I need you to burn those notes, once it's over. But take notes so that you can stay present in it. You're leaned in, you're giving them the eye contact, you're affirming them with your body language to let them know that you haven't drifted off somewhere else.
And then the way that we respond to the person is important as well.
Yes, you're basically summarizing. Don't be a parrot and just say, what I hear you saying is da da da. You summarize in your own words, because that's where empathy comes into play, right? And that's really what that person is seeking, is for someone to express empathy to them. So you're coming alongside and you're saying, this is what I'm hearing you say, describing what you see. Oftentimes I describe it as you're crawling down in that pit with them, you're sitting next to them, and you're describing what you see.
Okay, so as a friend, I'm listening to someone, they have opened up their heart, they've shared something painful with me, and then my response to them is, oh girl, yeah, I've been through that same thing. Let me tell you what happened to me.
Them down.
That's gonna shut them down.
That's going to shut them down. But if you start with, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I can only imagine how hard that was. And I want to honor your bravery in sharing that with me.
So is there anything else that you want to share with us regarding those who may be coping with some trauma from their childhood?
Is huge. And we would be hard pressed to find someone who wasn't touched by trauma, whether it's big T or little t, in some shape, form, or fashion. And so realizing that maybe some of the responses you have, maybe some of the relationship struggles, isn't because you as a person are broken. it could be connected to your experiences back from your childhood. And there are resources that can help you process through that. And even having the bravery to reach out to those resources needs to be acknowledged. But they're out there, and there's hope for that. And I think that's the biggest thing I want people to hear, is that while your experiences were dark and they took so much from you, there's hope, and that you don't have to stay in that space.
So, MyChelle, if somebody's wanting to get in contact with you, what is the best way to reach you?
The best way to get in contact with me would probably be email. And it's the letter M as in mom, D as in dad, Pinkerton, LMFT @gmail.com.
MyChelle, we thank you so very much for being here with us. Thank you so very much. As we conclude another insightful episode of One Rhyme at a Time, I want to thank our featured poet, Cynthia, and our guest mental health professional, MyChelle, our studio audience, and of course, you, our listeners, for joining us in this conversation. We would like to hear from you. What unhealed childhood trauma are you dealing with? How do you navigate in these times? Where do you find your peace? Tell us in an original poem that you've written in response to this podcast. Submit your poem to RNCPoetry @gmail.com for the chance to have it read in an upcoming episode. Until next time, this is the Poetic Diva. May your days be filled with inspiration, healing, and poetry, one rhyme at a time.
One rhyme at a time. Unpacking the meaning and the muse with the Poetic Diva is podcast programming that reminds us of the connection between artistic expression and mental wellness. This program has been brought to you by Rhyme and Chat Interactive Poetry Organization, thanks to the financial and technical support of the Lyndhurst Foundation, Arts Build, First Property Management, and Gold Nook Publishing. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, share, and leave comments for us on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback helps us as we continue to bring you meaningful content, one rhyme at a time.